hunting souls of the past, the place where buried stories breathe again. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time as you listen. And if you have not yet subscribed and liked our channel, please do so now, so you never miss a forgotten story that history tried to hide. Tonight, we travel to 1856, to a plantation where whispers moved faster than wind, and where 10,000 stingers would one day silence a kingdom of cruelty. In the summer of 1856, the heat in southern Georgia pressed down like a heavy hand. The cotton fields stretched wide and endless, white and silent under a burning sky. At the center of those fields stood Blackwood Plantation, tall and proud, painted white like innocence, though nothing about it was pure. The house looked peaceful from a distance, with wide balconies and tall windows, but beneath its floors lived fear, and beneath its soil lived secrets. The master of Blackwood Plantation was Edwin Harrow. He was a man of sharp eyes and colder words. He believed fear was stronger than chains. The people he enslaved knew his footsteps before they heard them. They could feel his presence like a coming storm. But there was one woman on that plantation who did not bow her head the same way others did. Her name was Miriam. Miriam was not young, but she was not yet old. Her back was strong, her hands steady, and her eyes always searching. She worked in the fields like the others, yet every evening when the sun began to sink, she walked beyond the cotton rows toward a quiet grove near the swamp. The other enslaved workers whispered about her. They said she spoke to insects. They said bees followed her like friends. Some even said she could command them. Near the edge of the grove stood several wooden boxes. They looked simple, almost careless, but inside them lived something powerful. Bees. Hundreds, then thousands. Miriam was the plantation beekeeper. Years ago, Edwin Harrow had ordered her to manage the hives so the plantation could sell honey at market. Honey brought good money. Honey was clean and sweet, unlike the work that produced it. At first, Miriam feared the bees. The buzzing sounded like warning drums, but slowly, carefully, she learned their ways. She watched how they moved as one body, how they protected their queen, how they worked without rest, how they defended their home with fierce unity. She learned that bees were not angry without reason. They struck only when threatened. They did not forget harm. And as years passed, Miriam began to see something else. She saw that the bees lived differently from the plantation. In the hive, no one ruled through terror. Every bee had a place. Every bee mattered. When danger came, they did not run. They rose together. The summer of 1856 was harsher than most. The rains did not come when they should. The cotton grew weak. Edwin Harrow grew furious. He blamed the workers. He blamed the sky. He blamed everyone but himself. Punishments increased. Whippings became common. Food portions shrank. Fear thickened in the air like smoke. One evening, as Miriam checked the hives, a young boy named Samuel approached her. Samuel was only 12 years old. His hands were small and already scarred. He asked Miriam in a quiet voice why the bees never seemed afraid. Miriam looked at the boy for a long moment. She said the bees trust each other. They protect their home, and when pushed too far, they answer together. Samuel asked if bees could ever fight men. Miriam did not answer at once. She simply closed one of the hive lids gently and said that even the smallest creature carries a weapon. Weeks passed. The plantation grew tense. Rumors began to spread that Edwin Harrow planned to sell several families south to Mississippi. Selling south meant worse fields, worse masters, and almost no hope of return. Mothers cried quietly at night. Fathers stared into darkness with empty eyes. Among the names whispered was Samuel. Miriam felt something change inside her when she heard that. It was not sudden anger. It was not wild rage. It was something slower and colder, a decision forming like a storm cloud far out at sea. She began to spend more time with the bees. She adjusted the hives. She studied their moods. She learned which sounds unsettled them, which smells stirred them, which movements felt like threat. One afternoon, Edwin Harrow rode past the grove and saw Miriam working. He laughed and said, "A woman who spends more time with insects than with people has already lost her mind." Miriam lowered her head. She said nothing, but as the horse trotted away, the bees buzzed louder than usual, as if they understood insult. The plan did not come to Miriam in one moment. It grew slowly, like honey filling a comb. She remembered stories her grandmother once told her in Africa before she was taken. Stories of warriors who used the land itself as weapon. Stories where nature answered injustice. She had thought those stories were only for children. Now, they felt real. Late one night, Miriam walked alone to the grove. The moon was thin, the air was thick. She carried small jars of crushed fruit and sugar water. She moved calmly, whispering softly as she worked. She opened certain hives just enough to disturb them, not to enrage them fully, but to prepare them. She understood something important. Bees remember. When troubled repeatedly, they grow defensive. When their home feels threatened, they strike without hesitation. Days later, Edwin Harrow announced a gathering. Buyers from Savannah would visit to inspect the plantation and purchase workers. It would take place near the main house. Tables would be set. Cotton samples displayed. Enslaved men and women would be lined up like animals. The date was fixed. The heat was rising. Miriam listened quietly as this news spread. She knew the grove lay not far from the path the buyers would ride through. She also knew something about bees that most men did not. Bees are drawn to strong scents. Sweat, perfume, alcohol. The buyers would bring all three. On the morning of the gathering, the sky felt strange, heavy, waiting. Samuel stood in line among others chosen for sale. His face was pale. His mother held his hand until they forced her away. Edwin Harrow greeted the visitors with loud pride. Laughter echoed across the yard. Meanwhile, in the grove, the hives trembled. Miriam had risen before dawn. She had quietly loosened several hive lids. Not enough to release them, but enough that the next disturbance would feel like invasion. She then walked toward the main yard, carrying with her a small cloth soaked in crushed berries and sugar hidden beneath her dress. The buyers arrived on horseback. The animals snorted in the heat. Flies buzzed. Men wiped sweat from their necks. One of them complained about the smell of the swamp nearby. Edwin Harrow waved him off and said it was nothing. Miriam moved slowly along the edge of the yard as if fetching water. She paused near a wooden post where several horses were tied. With careful motion, she rubbed the sweet cloth along the saddle straps and the sides of the posts. The scent was faint to humans, but not to bees. Then something small happened. A horse kicked at a buzzing insect near its ear. The movement startled another horse. The buyers laughed nervously. Edwin Harrow shouted at a stable boy, but from the grove came a sound that no one yet understood. A low hum, growing thicker, growing louder. Miriam stood still. Her heart beat fast, but her face showed nothing. She had not commanded the bees. She had only created the conditions. Bees do the rest. The first swarm rose like smoke above the trees. At first it looked almost beautiful, like a shifting cloud. Then the sound changed. It deepened. It moved with purpose. Samuel looked up. So did his mother. So did every soul in that yard. Edwin Harrow frowned. He had seen bees before. He thought they would pass. He was wrong. The swarm moved toward the strongest scent, toward sweat and perfume and sugar, toward the tied horses, toward the gathering of men who laughed too loudly. And in that moment, as 10,000 wings beat against the heavy air of 1856, Blackwood Plantation stood on the edge of a silence it had never known. The swarm did not fall from the sky all at once. It moved like a living shadow, thick and twisting, dark against the burning light of the afternoon. At first there were only a few bees circling the horses, then there were dozens, then hundreds. The sound grew from a hum into a roar. The horses began to panic. One reared high, eyes wide, foam gathering at its mouth. Another kicked hard against the wooden post, snapping the rope that held it. The buyers shouted in surprise, waving their hats, swatting at the air as if they could command the swarm away with noise. Edwin Harrow barked orders at the stable boys, his voice sharp and angry, but even he took a step back when the first sting struck his neck. He slapped at it and cursed loudly. That was when the air changed. The bees were no longer searching. They had chosen their target. The sweet scent rubbed along the saddles and posts pulled them in close, but it was the sudden wild movement of men and horses that turned warning into attack. Bees do not need permission to defend. They need only threat, and threat was everywhere. One buyer screamed as bees covered his face. He dropped to his knees, clawing at his skin. Another ran blindly toward the porch, but the swarm followed, thick and furious. The horses broke free and thundered across the yard, spreading panic like fire. Samuel stood frozen in line, his small body trembling. His mother grabbed him and pulled him toward the side of the yard where fewer men stood. The enslaved workers did not scream the way the buyers did. They moved quickly and low, covering their heads. Edwin Harrow tried to run toward the house, but his heavy coat and strong cologne made him a bright signal in the storm of wings. Bees clung to his hair, his collar, his hands. He stumbled on the porch steps and fell hard. His scream cut through the chaos, sharp and full of disbelief. He had ruled this land with certainty. He had believed nothing could challenge him here. Yet now he rolled across the wooden boards, covered in tiny bodies that did not care about his name or his power. The buyers fared no better. One man plunged into a water barrel, trying to drown the bees that swarmed his face. Another ran toward the cotton field, but the open space offered no shelter. 10,000 stingers moved with shared purpose. The air was alive with fury, yet there was no hatred in it. Only defense, only instinct, only response. Within minutes, the yard that had been loud with laughter became loud with pain. Then slowly, as the men scattered and the strongest scents faded into dust and sweat, the swarm began to thin. Bees dropped to the ground, some dying after leaving their stingers behind. Others rose and drifted back toward the grove, their mission complete. The horses stood trembling at the far edge of the field. The porch was nearly empty. Edwin Harrow lay groaning, his face swollen, his pride shattered. The buyers who could still stand staggered toward their wagons without speaking. No contracts were signed that day. No families were sold. No children were taken south. Miriam stood at the edge of the yard and watched in silence. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing was slow. She had not shouted. She had not lifted a weapon. She had only trusted what she had learned from creatures smaller than her thumb. Samuel looked at her from across the yard, his eyes wide with something new. It was not just relief. It was understanding. That night, the plantation was quiet in a way it had never been before. No music drifted from the big house. No laughter echoed across the porch. A doctor was called from the nearest town. He arrived after sunset, shocked by the sight of swollen faces and blistered skin. He worked through the night, applying poultices and muttering about nature being wild and unforgiving. Edwin Harrow survived, but the swelling left him weak for days. The buyers left before sunrise the next morning, their pride wounded deeper than their skin. Word began to spread across neighboring plantations about what had happened at Blackwood. Some called it accident. Some called it bad luck. A few whispered about judgment. In the quarters, hope moved carefully from person to person. No one spoke loudly about the swarm. No one pointed to Miriam. But eyes met in quiet knowledge. Something had shifted. Edwin Harrow could not prove anything. He suspected no one fully. How could he blame a woman who worked bees when bees had always been there? Yet he began to fear the grove. He ordered the hives burned. But when his overseer approached them with smoke and fire 2 days later, the bees rose again, not in attack, but in warning. The overseer retreated quickly, his courage gone. Edwin Harrow changed his mind. The honey brought money, and fear of another swarm settled heavy in his chest. Weeks passed. The heat eased slightly. No more buyers came that season. Samuel remained with his mother. The plantation did not become kind overnight. Cruelty does not vanish like mist. But something invisible had cracked. Edwin Harrow shouted less. He rode past the grove without stopping, and every time the distant hum of bees drifted through the air, he remembered the afternoon when 10,000 small wings reminded him that power is never as secure as it seems. Miriam continued her work as before. She tended the hives with care. She replaced damaged frames. She gathered honey in quiet jars. To anyone watching, she was only a beekeeper. But inside her, a deeper understanding had taken root. Nature does not always fight with noise. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it gathers strength in silence. And sometimes, when the moment is right, it answers. One evening, as the sun set in soft orange light, Samuel walked with her to the grove. He asked if the bees would ever rise like that again. Miriam looked at the hives, at the steady movement of workers entering and leaving, at the calm order within the wooden walls. She said the bees only rise when their home is threatened. Samuel nodded slowly. He understood more now. Protection is not anger. Defense is not cruelty. It is survival. And as the sky darkened over Blackwood Plantation in the year 1856, the hum of the hive sounded less like noise and more like promise. Part 3. The days that followed the swarm did not return to normal because nothing about Blackwood Plantation felt normal anymore. The air itself seemed to carry memory. When Edwin Harrow stepped outside, he looked up at the trees before looking at the fields. When he rode past the grove, he kept his horse at a careful distance. The porch where he once stood proud now felt smaller, as if the wood remembered the weight of his fear. The swelling on his face slowly faded, but the mark inside him remained. He spoke less loudly. He laughed less often. He no longer announced grand gatherings with the same bold voice, and though he never said it aloud, he feared the sound of buzzing more than thunder. Miriam noticed everything. She noticed how the overseer avoided the grove. She noticed how the stable boys checked the horses more carefully. She noticed how the enslaved workers carried themselves with a different kind of posture. It was not freedom. It was not safety. But it was something close to dignity. A silent knowledge that even the smallest force, when united, could change the direction of a day. Yet Miriam did not allow pride to grow inside her. Pride could be dangerous. Pride could invite carelessness. She knew the swarm had been powerful, but she also knew it had been a single moment. A single strike, and moments pass. What remains is patience. So she returned to her routine with careful attention. She cleaned the hive boxes. She replaced broken wood. She gathered honey slowly, leaving enough for the bees to remain strong. She never rushed them. She never disturbed them without reason. The grove became more than a workplace. It became a quiet school. Samuel visited often. He asked questions about queens and workers and drones. He asked how bees choose a new queen. He asked why some bees die after stinging. Miriam explained in simple words. She told him that a bee gives its life when it stings deeply. She told him that sacrifice is written into the hive. She told him that unity keeps them alive longer than strength alone. Samuel listened carefully, his young mind shaping these lessons into something larger than insects. Word of the swarm continued to spread beyond Blackwood. Travelers carried the story to nearby towns. Some said a storm of bees had appeared from nowhere. Some said the plantation had been cursed. Others laughed and said the buyers must have been foolish men who angered a nest. But among the enslaved on nearby lands, the story traveled differently. It was told in low voices at night. It was told with quiet smiles. It was told as proof that power is not always loud. Edwin Harrow felt the weight of rumor. He hated being spoken about in ways he could not control. He considered selling the plantation and moving north, but his pride kept him in place. Instead, he tightened certain rules. He ordered stricter supervision in the fields. He limited movement after sunset. He watched Miriam more closely, though he could not explain why. He had no evidence, only instinct. An instinct made him uneasy. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the swarm, a small accident changed the mood again. A young overseer named Caleb, new to the plantation and eager to prove himself, decided he would show bravery where others had shown fear. He walked toward the grove with a long stick, laughing loudly, saying bees were nothing but insects. Miriam saw him from a distance. She felt a cold wave move through her chest. She called out once, telling him to step back. He ignored her. He struck one of the hive boxes with his stick, hard enough to crack the corner. The sound was sharp. Wood split, and for a moment there was silence. Then the hum rose, not as wild as the day of the gathering, but sharp and clear. Bees poured from the broken hive, circling Caleb's head. He swung his stick wildly, striking air. That was his mistake. Fast movement, sudden threat. The bees responded. Within seconds he was shouting, dropping the stick, running blindly toward the open field. He fell twice before reaching the barn. The attack was brief, but fierce. Miriam moved quickly, lighting a small smoker she kept for such moments. Cool smoke drifted over the hive, calming the bees, signaling that the danger had passed. The swarm thinned. The grove returned to steady sound. Caleb survived, but his pride did not. He spent 2 days in bed with swollen hands and a bruised face from his fall. Edwin Harrow was furious, not at Miriam but at Caleb. He ordered no one to approach the grove without permission again, and though he did not admit it, fear guided his command. After that day, the grove became almost sacred ground. No one entered without care. The enslaved workers began to see the bees not just as insects, but as guardians. Children were told to respect the grove. Mothers warned them never to throw stones near the hives. Even the overseers kept distance as summer slowly shifted toward early autumn in 1856, the cotton harvest began. Work remained hard. The sun still burned. The system of bondage still held its chains tight, but something invisible had taken root beneath it. Edwin Harrow no longer spoke of selling Samuel. He delayed all talk of buyers until the following year. Whether it was fear of another swarm or simple desire to avoid embarrassment, no one knew. Miriam did not ask. She understood that victory does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it buys time. And time can grow into change. One quiet evening, as golden light filtered through the trees, Samuel asked Miriam a question that made her pause. He asked if bees know they are small. Miriam looked at the hive entrance, at the steady stream of workers returning with pollen on their legs. She said bees do not measure themselves by size. They measure themselves by purpose. Samuel thought about that for a long moment. He said maybe people should do the same. Miriam smiled softly. She knew that true resistance is not always in the strike. It is in the lesson that remains after the strike. And so, life on Blackwood Plantation moved forward, changed in ways both visible and hidden. Edwin Harrow carried his fear like a shadow. The buyers avoided that land. The grove stood strong, and each time the wind carried the gentle hum of 10,000 wings, it reminded every soul who heard it that even in a world built on cruelty, nature still listens. And sometimes it answers. Autumn came softly to Blackwood Plantation in the year 1856. The fierce heat of summer eased into warm afternoons and cooler nights. The cotton fields turned heavy with ready harvest, and the trees near the swamp began to shed dry leaves that crunched under quiet footsteps. On the surface, the plantation looked calm. Wagons rolled slowly. Bales of cotton were stacked high. The big house stood tall as always. But underneath that calm, something deeper had shifted. Something Edwin Harrow could not control and could not fully understand. He had always believed fear flowed in one direction, from master to enslaved, from whip to back, from order to obedience. Now he knew fear could move the other way too. He felt it each time he heard the distant hum from the grove. He felt it when he stepped onto the porch and glanced toward the trees. He felt it when neighbors rode past and asked careful questions about the day of the bees. He answered with short words, calling it an accident, blaming the heat, blaming foolish horses. But inside, he remembered falling to the porch boards, unable to command even the smallest creature to obey him. Miriam continued her work with steady patience. She repaired the hive Caleb had broken, shaping new wood with careful hands. She checked each frame for healthy comb. She gathered honey only when the hive was strong enough to spare it. She never wasted movement. She never rushed. The bees responded to her calm. When she approached, the hum softened. When she lifted a frame, they moved around her fingers without panic. She had learned their language, and they had learned her scent. Samuel now spent more time at the grove than in the fields when he could. Edwin Harrow had not officially assigned him there, but the master did not stop it either. Perhaps he believed the bees were safer when managed by someone loyal to Miriam. Perhaps he simply wanted distance from the hive. Samuel watched carefully as Miriam explained the structure of the colony. She told him that every hive carries a single queen, but the queen does not rule with cruelty. She serves the life of the colony by laying eggs. The workers are all female. They gather nectar, build comb, defend the hive. The drones exist for one purpose, to mate, and then they die. Samuel listened closely. He saw something powerful in that structure. Power was not loud. It was organized. It was shared. And it was protected fiercely when threatened. One evening, as a thin mist rose from the swamp, a stranger arrived at Blackwood Plantation. He was not a buyer. He was not a neighbor. He introduced himself as Reverend Thomas Hale, a traveling preacher who claimed he was spreading the word of God across the countryside. Edwin Harrow allowed him to stay the night, eager to show himself as a man of faith and order. The preacher walked through the fields, greeting the enslaved workers with careful politeness. His eyes missed little. He asked quiet questions. He noticed the grove. He noticed Miriam standing near the hives. Later that night, in the dim light behind the quarters, Reverend Hale approached Miriam and Samuel. His voice was low and steady. He said he had heard stories of a swarm that silenced cruelty. He said such stories travel far. Miriam did not confirm or deny anything. She simply said, "Bees defend their home." The preacher nodded slowly. He said sometimes God uses small wings to carry large lessons. Then he added something unexpected. He said there were people in the north who were working to end bondage. He said networks existed, quiet paths, hidden guides, coded messages passed from one plantation to another. Miriam felt her heartbeat shift. She had heard whispers before, but whispers were dangerous. Hope could cost lives. She asked him why he told her this. He looked toward the grove and said, "Because courage already lives here." Before dawn, Reverend Hale left the plantation. But he left something behind, not an object, but an idea. The idea that resistance did not have to end with a swarm, that protection could grow into escape, that time bought by 10,000 stingers could be used wisely. Over the next weeks, Miriam thought carefully. She did not act quickly. Quick action without plan leads to ruin. Instead, she listened. She observed which overseers drank heavily at night. She noted which paths through the woods were less watched. She paid attention to the direction of the river beyond the swamp. Samuel sensed her change. One evening he asked if she planned to leave. Miriam did not answer directly. She said bees sometimes swarm not to attack, but to find a new home. When a hive grows too crowded or threatened, a portion of the colony rises and follows a queen to safer ground. They do not destroy the old hive. They simply build another. Samuel understood. The idea of leaving terrified him, but staying terrified him more. Winter approached slowly. The cotton harvest ended. The nights grew colder. Bees gathered tighter inside the hive, forming a living cluster to keep warm. Miriam reduced her visits, knowing the colony needed rest. Edwin Harrow seemed calmer during winter. Cold weather dulled fear. The hum from the grove was softer. But fear does not disappear. It waits. One late evening in early December of 1856, Miriam met quietly with 3 trusted adults from the quarters. Samuel sat close by, listening. She spoke softly about the river north of the swamp. She spoke about traveling at night. She spoke about following the North Star. She did not promise safety. She promised only possibility. The others listened with wide eyes. One woman began to cry softly, not from sadness, but from the weight of decision. Leaving meant risk. Staying meant slow death. The choice felt like standing at the edge of deep water. In the days that followed, Miriam continued her work as if nothing had changed. She harvested the last jars of honey before full winter. She delivered them to the storehouse near the big house. Edwin Harrow counted them carefully, unaware that the true harvest had already taken place. A harvest of courage. A harvest of time. On the final night before their planned departure, Miriam walked alone to the grove. The air was cold. The stars were sharp and bright. She stood beside the hives and placed her hand gently on the wood. The bees inside were quiet but alive, clustered together in warmth. She whispered a thank you, not in loud words, but in breath. The swarm had not freed them, but it had opened a door, and sometimes a door is all that is needed. As she turned back toward the quarters, the wind moved softly through the trees. It carried a faint hum, not loud, not fierce, but steady, a reminder that even the smallest wings can shake a kingdom. The night chosen for departure arrived without warning to anyone but those who needed to know. It was late December in the year 1856. The air was sharp with cold, and frost lay thin across the cotton stubble like pale dust. The moon was small, giving little light, which was exactly what Miriam had hoped for. Darkness was a shield if one knew how to move inside it. Edwin Harrow had retired early that evening after heavy drink. Winter always made him restless, and he filled that restlessness with whiskey and loud talk that faded into silence before midnight. The overseers slept in their quarters near the barn, wrapped in blankets, unaware that the plantation they guarded so tightly was about to lose what they believed they owned. Miriam stood just outside the quarters, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Samuel stood beside her, trying to breathe quietly. 3 others waited in shadow: Ruth, whose husband had been sold 2 years earlier; Isaiah, a tall field hand with steady strength; and old Ben, whose age made him slow but whose knowledge of the land was unmatched. They carried almost nothing: a small bundle of food, a tin cup, a piece of cloth each. Miriam had warned them that weight could slow them more than hunger. The river north of the swamp was their first goal. Beyond that, forest. Beyond that, unknown roads. Miriam looked once toward the grove. The hives were dark shapes against darker trees. She had visited them earlier that day under the excuse of checking winter stores. She had secured the lids tightly. She had left them strong. Bees survive winter by staying close together. Humans, she thought, survive the same way. With a final glance toward the big house, she gave a small nod. No words were spoken. Words could carry. They moved quietly toward the edge of the field, stepping where frost muted sound. The swamp lay ahead, thick and shadowed. Old Ben led them through a narrow path he had once used to gather firewood. The mud was cold beneath their thin shoes. Samuel slipped once, and Isaiah caught him before he fell fully. No one scolded. No one whispered blame. Fear walked beside them like a silent companion. Each crack of branch felt louder than thunder. Each distant animal cry felt like alarm. Behind them, Blackwood Plantation slept. For now. The river took longer to reach than Miriam had hoped. The cold slowed them. The swamp twisted their path. But just before dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they heard the soft rush of water. The river was not wide, but it was deep in places and fast from winter rain. Miriam had known this crossing would test them. She had chosen a narrow bend where fallen logs formed partial bridge. Isaiah stepped first, testing each log with careful pressure. Ruth followed, holding Samuel's hand. Old Ben crossed last before Miriam. Halfway across, Samuel's foot slipped on wet wood. His small body tilted toward the water. Ruth gasped, but Isaiah grabbed his arm just in time. The river pulled hard at Samuel's leg, soaking his trousers. They hauled him back up. No one spoke. There was no time. Once across, they did not rest. Dawn was dangerous. Light revealed shapes. They moved deeper into the forest, where trees stood tall and branches tangled thick above. By full morning, Blackwood Plantation would wake. Someone would count heads. Someone would notice absence. And Edwin Harrow would understand. Back at the plantation, morning came slowly. A stable boy rose first, rubbing sleep. Anger burned hotter than fear. How dare they? How dare anyone believe they could walk away? Edwin Harrow rode toward the grove first, not because he believed they were there, but because something in him tied every act of defiance to that place. The hives stood quiet. Frost clung to their edges. No movement betrayed escape. He cursed under his breath. Then he turned his horse toward the swamp. Meanwhile, Miriam and the others had found temporary shelter beneath a thick cluster of pines. They collapsed in exhaustion for a brief rest. Samuel shivered from wet clothes. Miriam removed his soaked trousers and wrapped his legs in dry cloth from her bundle. She knew cold could kill as surely as capture. Isaiah kept watch. Old Ben studied the sky. Clouds were gathering. Snow might fall. Snow could hide tracks or reveal them. Every element of nature was both friend and danger. By mid-morning they heard it. Faint at first, then clearer. Horses, voices, dogs. Edwin Harrow had unleashed trackers from a neighboring plantation. Miriam's chest tightened, but her face remained calm. Panic spreads faster than dogs. She spoke quietly. They would split briefly. Isaiah and old Ben would move east for a short distance, leaving heavier footprints. Miriam, Ruth, and Samuel would move north along rocky ground where tracks were harder to read. They would regroup by nightfall at a marked oak tree old Ben described. The decision was risky, but staying together made them easier to follow. They parted without embrace. Time did not allow it. Miriam gripped Samuel's hand and began moving through brush. Ruth followed close. The sound of dogs grew louder. Samuel's breathing quickened. Miriam leaned close and whispered that bees do not outrun storms. They find shelter until storms pass. Samuel nodded, forcing himself steady. The forest thickened. Branches scratched their skin. Twice they dropped low as riders passed within sight. Once a dog barked sharply nearby, and Miriam felt her heart slam against her ribs. She reached into her small bundle and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. It was a small jar of honey mixed with crushed wild onion she had prepared days earlier. She smeared a thin line of it along a fallen log far from their path. The strong scent would distract dogs, drawing them sideways. It was a small chance, but small chances had worked before. The barking shifted direction soon after. By late afternoon, they reached the marked oak. Isaiah and old Ben were already there, breathing hard but alive. The dogs' voices had faded. Snow began to fall lightly, covering ground in thin white veil. Tracks disappeared slowly beneath it. Night approached again. They had survived the first day, but Edwin Harrow would not give up easily. As darkness settled, Miriam looked north, where distant freedom might exist. She knew the journey ahead would test more than their bodies. It would test belief. The swarm had silenced a plantation for a day. Now they had to silence fear within themselves for many more days to come. And somewhere far behind them, in a grove near a silent house, 10,000 bees rested in a winter cluster, unaware that their lesson had taken flight. Snow fell thicker through the night, covering branches, softening sound, turning the forest into a pale and silent world. Miriam did not sleep. She sat with her back against the marked oak tree, listening to every shift of wind, every crack of ice beneath settling wood. Samuel slept against Ruth's side, his breath uneven from cold and fear. Isaiah stood watch for hours before old Ben replaced him. The forest felt endless, but Miriam knew they could not remain still for long. Edwin Harrow was not a man who accepted loss quietly. By morning, the snow had erased nearly every clear footprint. That was mercy, but snow also revealed fresh tracks easily, and moving across open ground would expose them. Miriam decided they would travel while light snow still fell, allowing flakes to blur their path as they moved. They ate small portions of cornbread saved from the night before and drank from the river's edge after breaking thin ice. The water burned their throats with cold. They moved north again, deeper into forest that grew denser and wilder. Around midday they reached a narrow ridge where the land rose sharply. From there, old Ben pointed toward faint smoke far in the distance. A settlement, perhaps, or another plantation. They could not risk walking straight toward it. Instead, they angled west, following a shallow stream that wound between rocks. Streams were useful. Water confused dogs. The sound of running water masked human steps. By afternoon, they heard distant shouting again. Edwin Harrow's riders were still searching. The sound carried faint but real. Miriam's jaw tightened. She had hoped snow would slow pursuit more than this. Samuel stumbled often, exhaustion weighing on his small legs. Isaiah lifted him once and carried him for part of the path. No one complained. Each person carried part of the burden. As daylight faded, the forest opened suddenly into a clearing where an old abandoned cabin stood crooked and broken. The roof sagged, and one wall leaned inward. Old Ben believed it had once belonged to a trapper, long gone. Miriam hesitated. Shelter offered warmth, but also risk. Smoke from fire could betray them. Yet Samuel's lips were turning pale from cold. She chose carefully. No fire, only shelter from wind. They entered quietly. Inside, the floor was layered with dust and old leaves. Isaiah blocked part of the doorway with fallen wood to reduce wind. Ruth wrapped Samuel tighter. Miriam stood near a narrow crack in the wall, watching outside. Night came again. This time no snow fell. The sky cleared, revealing hard, bright stars. Miriam found the North Star and fixed it in her mind. That star would guide them beyond this land. Near midnight, hoofbeats passed not far from the clearing. Dogs barked once, then faded. The riders did not stop at the cabin. Perhaps they believed no one would hide so close to open land. Perhaps they were tired. Edwin Harrow's anger would not rest, but even anger grows weary in cold. At dawn of the second day, Miriam made a bold decision. They would aim for a small town old Ben remembered from years past, nearly 2 days further north. In that town lived a free black blacksmith known quietly among field hands as a man who listened more than he spoke. If anyone might guide them toward safer roads, it would be him. The journey was harder than the first day. Snow melted into mud. Mud clung to their feet. Samuel's cough began to rise, dry and sharp. Miriam worried about sickness. Freedom means nothing to a body too weak to walk. They pressed on. By late afternoon of the third day since leaving Blackwood Plantation, the outline of a small settlement appeared beyond trees. Smoke rose from chimneys. The sound of hammer striking metal echoed faintly. Isaiah suggested waiting until night to enter. Miriam agreed. They hid near tree line until darkness settled. When lamps began to glow inside town houses, they moved quietly along the edge, avoiding Main Road. The blacksmith's shop stood near the far end, marked by an iron wheel hanging above the door. A dim light burned inside. Miriam approached alone, telling the others to remain hidden. She knocked softly. The hammering stopped. Silence followed. Then the door opened slightly. A tall man with broad shoulders and careful eyes looked out. He said nothing at first. Miriam spoke slowly. She mentioned Reverend Thomas Hale. She mentioned bees defending their home. The man's expression changed slightly. He opened the door wider and let her inside. His name was Elijah Turner. He had heard whispers of Blackwood Plantation and the swarm. He had also heard rumors that Edwin Harrow was searching furiously for 5 runaways. Elijah listened without interrupting as Miriam told him they needed guidance north. When she finished, he nodded once. He said the road ahead was dangerous, but not impossible. There were safe houses scattered along hidden routes, farms owned by people who opposed bondage quietly but firmly. He warned that patrols increased near main roads. They must travel by night, mostly. He also said Samuel's cough needed attention. He provided dried herbs and instructed Ruth how to brew them without strong scent. Elijah agreed to shelter them in his cellar for 1 night only. By the next evening, they must leave. Risk could not linger long in one place. When Miriam returned to the tree line and signaled the others, relief washed through them like warm water. For the first time since leaving, they slept under roof not owned by Edwin Harrow. In the cellar that night, Miriam lay awake again, staring at low wooden beams above. She thought of the grove. She thought of the bees clustered in winter warmth. She wondered if Edwin Harrow stood there now, staring at hives with anger and confusion. She wondered if he understood that control built on fear cracks easily. By morning, Samuel's cough had softened slightly. Elijah provided simple shoes, stronger than what they wore, and a rough map drawn in charcoal. He gave final warning. If caught beyond this town, punishment would be severe. Edwin Harrow's pride would demand an example. Miriam nodded. Fear remained, but fear no longer ruled her. They left after sunset once more, heading north under a cold, clear sky. Behind them, Blackwood Plantation still stood. Edwin Harrow still searched. But distance was growing. Each step north was a quiet answer to chains left behind. And somewhere far south, in a grove that had once roared with 10,000 wings, the hive endured, unaware that its lesson now traveled far beyond honey and stingers. The road north did not look like a road at all. It was a thin suggestion of passage between trees, a memory of footsteps pressed into soil by others who had dared before them. Elijah's charcoal map was simple, only shapes and marks, but old Ben studied it carefully each night before they moved. He traced the path with his finger, nodding slowly, committing every bend and river crossing to memory. Miriam walked beside him, her eyes lifted often to the North Star. That steady point in the sky had become more than light. It was direction. It was promise. The first night after leaving the blacksmith's cellar, they traveled through open farmland. This land was not like Blackwood Plantation. The fields were smaller, the houses humbler. Still, danger lived here too. Patrol riders moved along main roads, lanterns swinging from saddle hooks. Once they saw two riders pass close enough to hear their quiet conversation. The word reward floated in the air. Edwin Harrow had offered money. Money made strangers hungry. They waited flat against cold earth until the riders disappeared. Samuel's cough returned briefly in the damp air, but Ruth held him close and whispered calm words. By the second night, they reached the first marked farmhouse on Elijah's map. It belonged to a widow named Margaret Bell. She opened her door only after Miriam spoke the phrase Elijah had taught her. "Honey runs thick in winter." Margaret studied their faces carefully. She did not smile, but she stepped aside and let them enter. Her house was small but warm. She fed them hot broth without asking many questions. Before dawn, she led them to her barn and showed them a hidden compartment beneath loose floorboards where they could rest through daylight. The space was tight and smelled of hay, but it was safety. During those quiet hours, Samuel asked Miriam if Edwin Harrow still searched for them. Miriam answered honestly, "Yes. A man who believes he owns others does not accept loss easily." Samuel was silent for a long time. Then he asked if Edwin feared bees now. Miriam almost smiled. She said fear is a teacher. Whether Edwin listens to that teacher is his choice. That evening, Margaret gave them directions to the next safe house. She pressed dried apples into Ruth's hand and wished them courage. As they left, she said softly that not all freedom is loud. Sometimes it moves in whispers between strangers. The journey continued for many days. They crossed narrow bridges over icy streams. They hid beneath wagons when patrols passed. Once they lay flat in tall, dead grass while a search party moved within sight, dogs sniffing and men shouting. Miriam's heart pounded so loud she feared the dogs would hear it, but the wind shifted, carrying their scent away. The searchers moved on. Samuel grew stronger as days passed. The herbs Elijah had given worked slowly. His cough lessened. His steps grew steadier. He began to ask questions again, not about fear, but about what lay ahead. What would freedom look like? Would there be bees there too? Miriam told him bees live wherever flowers grow. Freedom is like that. It grows where care and courage meet. One night, as they approached a narrow mountain pass, snow began again. This time it was heavier, swirling in thick white sheets. The path became nearly invisible. Isaiah suggested waiting for clearer weather. But old Ben warned that waiting in open pass could trap them if patrol riders followed tracks before snow deepened. Miriam decided they would move slowly, but continue. The mountain wind cut through their thin coats. Samuel stumbled again, and Isaiah lifted him without complaint. Halfway through the pass, they heard distant hoofbeats echoing against rock walls. The sound carried strangely in the storm. They could not tell direction. Miriam led them toward a cluster of large boulders and pressed them into a narrow space between stone and earth. Snow covered them quickly. They held their breath as riders passed along the main trail above. The horses snorted, uneasy in storm. One rider shouted that no one would be foolish enough to cross tonight. Another laughed and agreed. The sound faded. Only wind remained. They stayed hidden long after hoofbeats disappeared. When they finally emerged, snow had erased nearly every sign of their presence. By the time they crossed the pass fully, the land beyond looked different. Hills rolled wider. Forest thinned slightly. Air felt sharper but cleaner. Old Ben stopped at the crest of a hill and looked north with quiet wonder. He said softly that beyond 2 more rivers lay a state where bondage had weaker grip. Not gone, but weaker. The thought filled them with cautious hope. Yet danger still followed. On the 10th night since leaving Blackwood Plantation, they reached a larger town where safe houses were fewer and suspicion stronger. Elijah's map showed only one mark here, a church with broken steeple at the edge of the town. They approached near midnight. The church stood dark and quiet. Miriam knocked 3 times, paused, then once more, as instructed. No answer came. She knocked again. Silence. Fear crept up her spine. Had the contact been arrested? Had word spread too quickly? Isaiah suggested leaving town immediately, but footsteps approached from inside. The door opened slowly. A young woman peered out, lantern in hand. She looked frightened, but determined. She said the pastor had been taken weeks earlier for helping runaways. She herself was only caretaker now. Miriam hesitated. Trust was thin, but the woman stepped aside and whispered that she would not turn away those who had come this far. They rested inside pews until dawn. The young woman warned them that bounty hunters had been seen nearby. Edwin Harrow's reward had traveled north. Money carried long reach. That news struck hard. Distance did not erase pursuit. Miriam gathered the group before leaving the church. She spoke clearly. Freedom was near, but danger sharper than before. They must be careful with every step. Fear would try to return now, louder than before, but they had survived swamp, river, snow, and search. They had learned from bees that unity protects. As they left town at dusk, Samuel looked back once at the broken steeple. He asked Miriam if bees ever forget their first hive. She answered quietly that bees remember, but they do not return if the hive is poisoned. They build new life instead. Ahead of them lay one final river, wider than the first, colder than any they had crossed. Beyond that river, they would step into land where Edwin Harrow's power thinned like smoke in wind. Behind them, Blackwood Plantation still stood in the year 1856, its master pacing restless halls, his pride wounded, his authority questioned by whisper and rumor. And in a grove near that house, 10,000 bees endured winter in a patient cluster, unaware that their single furious afternoon had set 5 souls on a path toward a different dawn. The final river did not announce itself with a gentle sound. It roared long before they saw it. The water moved wide and dark beneath a sky heavy with low clouds. Ice floated along its surface in broken sheets. The current was fast, stronger than the smaller rivers they had crossed before. Old Ben stood at the bank and removed his hat slowly. He said this was the line many feared most. Beyond this water lay a state where bondage still existed, but not with the same reach. Patrols were fewer. Rewards were harder to claim. Yet the river itself was merciless. It did not care about hope or fear. It moved with a cold purpose. Miriam studied the banks carefully. A narrow ferry crossing lay half a mile east, but that path would be watched. Bridges meant eyes. Eyes meant questions. Instead, she chose a bend where fallen trees had gathered near a shallow curve. The water there seemed slightly less wild, though still dangerous. Isaiah tested the edge with a long branch. The depth shifted quickly. Samuel looked at the river and swallowed hard. Ruth squeezed his hand. Miriam spoke calmly. They would cross together, bound by rope made from twisted cloth Isaiah had prepared days earlier. If one slipped, the others would hold. They tied themselves in order, Isaiah first, then Samuel, then Ruth, then Miriam, with old Ben last, to steady from behind. The water struck like a blade when they stepped in. It cut through fabric and into bone. Samuel gasped, but did not cry out. They moved slowly, feeling each step along the unseen riverbed. Ice brushed against their legs. Halfway across, the current pulled harder. Isaiah stumbled, dropping to one knee. The rope tightened sharply. Samuel slipped forward, nearly falling. Miriam dug her feet into rock and leaned back with all her strength. Old Ben braced behind her. For one long breath, it seemed the river would take them. Then Isaiah found footing again. They pushed forward inch by inch until the far bank rose beneath their hands. When they finally crawled onto solid ground, they lay there shaking, too cold to speak. But they were across. Miriam rolled onto her back and stared at the sky. No words came, only breath turning to steam above her face. Samuel began to laugh softly, not from humor, but from release. Ruth joined him, tears mixing with river water. Old Ben whispered that Edwin Harrow's reach ended at that water. Perhaps not fully, but enough. They did not rest long. Wet clothes could freeze in night air. They moved into a cluster of trees and built the smallest possible fire shielded by stone. Isaiah gathered dried twigs from beneath thick branches. Miriam kept flame low. The warmth returned slowly, painfully, but it returned. As dawn broke pale and thin, they looked back across the river. Mist rose above it like ghostly curtain. Somewhere far beyond that mist lay Blackwood Plantation. Somewhere beyond it, a grove of hives rested silent in winter. Edwin Harrow might still be searching, but the river now stood between his anger and their footsteps. They walked north through new land. Farms looked different here. Fields were smaller. People moved without chains in some places, though prejudice and danger still existed. Freedom was not perfect. It was fragile. They reached a modest settlement by late afternoon. A man chopping wood looked up as they approached. He studied them carefully, noting wet shoes and tired faces. Miriam met his gaze without lowering her head. After a long silence, he nodded toward a narrow road and said there was work at a lumber yard farther north, and no one there asked too many questions. He did not smile, but his voice held no threat. That night they slept in an abandoned shed outside town, exhausted beyond words. Samuel curled beside Miriam and asked quietly if they were free now. Miriam considered the question carefully. Freedom was not a single step. It was a path that must be walked daily. She told him they had crossed a line that fear once guarded. That mattered. Over the next weeks they found small work in scattered places. Isaiah's strength earned him labor cutting timber. Ruth found washing work in homes that paid little but asked few questions. Old Ben offered knowledge of land and crops to farmers who valued experience. Samuel helped wherever he could. And Miriam, when spring began to touch the earth, sought out hives again. Bees lived here too, not in grand groves, but in wild clusters along forest edges. She approached one hive slowly, remembering her first fear years ago. The bees moved calmly, unaware of the journey their kind had helped to begin. She smiled softly. In the spring of 1857, Miriam began keeping bees once more, this time not under command, but by choice. She built simple wooden boxes with Isaiah's help. She gathered wild swarms and guided them gently into new homes. Honey became not profit for a master, but food for her small community. Word spread quietly of a woman who understood bees as if they were kin. Samuel often stood beside her as she worked. He no longer asked if bees could fight men. He understood that question fully now. Instead, he asked how to protect hives through winter, how to harvest without harm, how to listen for changes in sound that signal trouble. Miriam taught him everything. Years later, long after Edwin Harrow's name faded into dust and rumor, people in that northern settlement would speak of Miriam, the beekeeper. They would tell children how she once lived where cruelty ruled, and how 10,000 stingers rose in one fierce afternoon to remind a plantation that power built on fear can be shaken by wings no larger than a thumb. They would not always know every detail. Stories change as they travel, but the truth beneath would remain. That in 1856, in a grove near a house painted white, a woman learned from bees that unity is strength, patience is weapon, and timing is everything. And when the moment came, she did not need a sword. She needed only knowledge, courage, and 10,000 small guardians ready to defend their home. The world often celebrates